Good morning, everybody. Today I'm going to go through sine and cosine graphs day 2. So yesterday you should have learned kind of the basic features of a sine and cosine graph. And so today we're going to do a few things. We're going to write equations from features, and then we're going to write equations from a graph. Okay? So the first question says, what is the equation of a sine function that rises 1 units above the midline at y equals -3 and has a period of pi over 3? So let's first start with just your basic form. Y equals a sine bx. I'm not going to do the phase shift. I'm just going to do px and then plus d. Okay, so we know A is our amplitude. We know that 2 pi over B is our period. And we know that plus or minus D is our midline. Okay, so again, A, amplitude, 2 pi over B is your period, which is one cycle of the graph. And D is your midline equation. So in this particular description, we are given that the midline is -3. So I know I'm going to put -3 here. We know that the equation or the function rises 1 unit above the midline. So that means your amplitude has to be 1, right? Because the distance that you go above and below the midline, that's your amplitude. So our amplitude's 1. Now you can choose to write 1 or you could just leave it. There's an understood 1 there. So I'm going to put a 1 for right now. And then our period is pi over 3. Well, if we know that 2 pi over b equals the period, then b will be 2 pi over the period. So we're going to do a little calculation down here. 2 pi over 3, because we need our b value for the equation. So we're going to go 2 pi over 1 times 3 over pi. We have to multiply by the reciprocal. The pi's will cancel. B equals 6. So I'm going to put that in the equation here, 6x minus 3. So our equation, let me go in orange, y equals sine 6x minus 3. What is the equation of a cosine function that rises 2 units above the midline at y equals -4 and has a period of pi? Okay, so we're going to use our general form, right, of a cosine function. Y equals a cosine bx. We're not going to worry about phase shifts. You don't really see phase shifts until you get to pre-calculus, plus d. Okay, so we know our midline is -4, so we're going to go ahead and put that at the end. We know that it rises 2 units above the midline. There's your amplitude. We need to find our b value. Our b value is going to be 2 pi over the period, because remember, it's just manipulating the equation. 2 pi over b gives you your period. So if we know the period, we can just do 2 pi divided by the period. So we're going to set it up. 2 pi over pi. This one's a little bit easier because the pi's just cancel. And you're left with 2 for your b value. There's your equation given the features. Write a sine function that has an amplitude of 5, a midline of 4, and a period of 3/2. Okay? Y equals amplitude first. Here, remember amplitude is a measure of distance from the midline of a trig function to its max or its min. So amplitude always has to be positive. Y equals 5 sine. Okay. We know that our period is 3/2. So to get our b value, we're going to do 2 pi over 3/2 to get our b value. So we're going to go 2 pi over 1 times the reciprocal, 2/3, which will be 4 pi over 3. That's our b value. So we're going to put it into the function, 4 pi over 3. We need to put an x, close it in parentheses. Our midline is plus 4. Write a cosine function that has a midline of 5, an amplitude of 4, and a period of a period of pi over 3. Okay, y equals 5. Ooh, no, midline is 5, amplitude is 4, period is pi over 3. So amplitude first, it's a cosine function. Period is pi over 3, so to find our b value, we do 2 pi divided by the period. 2 pi over 1 times the reciprocal, 3 over pi. The pi's will cancel. Your b value is 6. Stick it in there, 6x. Midline is plus 5. Okay, now it's reading from a graph, okay? I'm going to kind of maybe do it a little bit unconventional because I want you to, basically understand, just looking at the features kind of separately and then how it all comes together, okay? So the first thing I do is I look at the graph and I can identify that our midline is here, okay? How do I know it's the midline? Because from that midline, it reaches as high as 1 and it reaches as low as -1. Okay, so I know that our amplitude is 1. Okay, I realize it's not starting at its midline. Because it's not starting at its midline, it's a cosine function. Now, yesterday you should have talked about how cosine functions start max, midline, min, midline, back to max. When it doesn't start at its max and it's flipped over, there's a leading negative. There is an x-axis reflection in this particular question, okay? We can see here, there we go. We can see here it's starting at -1. So that means there is an x-axis reflection. Okay, so it's a cosine function. It is starting at its minimum, so it's a x-axis reflection. Its midline is y equals 0. Its amplitude is 1. And I notice that one cycle of the graph, let me use green here. So remember we talked about max, midline, min, midline, max. Well, because this is reflected, it's going to go minimum, midline, maximum, midline, back to minimum. That's one cycle. One cycle is complete, or its period is 2 pi. So its b value is going to be 2 pi over 2 pi, which is 1. So our equation is going to be y equals, we don't really need to put a 1 because it's understood for its amplitude. Y equals cosine. Our b value is 1 again, so we can just put an x, and its midline is 0. So this is actually just the parent function of a cosine. Oh, I forgot the oh, geez, hello. Oh, its amplitude is 1. However, because it has an x-axis reflection, there's a negative in the front. I almost forgot the negative. Negative in the front. So it isn't the parent function because it has an x-axis reflection. So it does have a transformation. Okay, next graph. Immediately, I'm going to recognize that it reaches as high as 2 and as low as -2, so its midline is here. Y equals 0. Because it reaches as high as 2 and low as -2, its amplitude is 2. Okay? We talked yesterday that sine functions start at their midline, and we can see it starts at its midline. But instead of going midline max, midline min back to the midline, it's going midline minimum, midline maximum back to the midline. So this also has an x-axis reflection. Okay? Its period, one cycle of the graph, is 2 pi. So its b value is going to be 2 pi over 2 pi, which again is 1. Okay, so let's write the equation. Y equals, because it has that x-axis reflection, I'm not going to forget the negative this time, negative, amplitude is 2, it's a sine function, its b value was 1, so I'm just going to put an x, and then its midline equation is y equals 0, so I don't need anything at the end. Okay, next graph, I can see that it reaches as high as 1 and as low as -1. So therefore, its midline is again y equals 0. Okay, it starts at its midline. So because it starts at its midline, it's a sine function. Remember, sine function starts at their midline. Okay, so it goes midline, maximum, midline, minimum, back to its midline. One cycle of the graph stops at 2 pi, so it's stops at pi, so its period is pi. So its b value for our equation is 2 pi over pi, because it's 2 pi over the period, which leaves us to just 2. Its amplitude is 1 because it reaches as high as 1 and as low as -1. Okay, so why did I put 2? Oh my word. Its amplitude is 1. It reaches as high as 1 and as low as -1. So our equation is y equals, its amplitude's 1. There's no reflection, so we can just leave it. There's an understood 1 there. Y equals sine. Its b value is 2, so I'm going to put 2x. And its midline is y equals 0, so I don't need anything at the end. Okay, next graph. It reaches as high as 2, okay, high as 2, there's its maximum. It reaches as low as -6. So in order to find its amplitude, I need to go 2 minus -6, which is 8, divided by 2 is 4. So I know I'm going to go 4 down from the maximum to find my midline, or 4 up from the minimum. So 4 up from the minimum leaves us at negative 2. So our midline equation is going to be here. There's our midline. How do I know? Because I did 2, which was the max, minus the min. 2 minus negative 6 is 8. 8 divided by 2 is 4. So the distance from the midline to the max is 4. The distance from the midline to the min is 4. So our amplitude is 4. Ooh, I spelled that wrong. Okay, our amplitude is 4. Our midline equation is y equals negative 2. Okay, I can see that it starts at its midline. Okay, watch. Midline. Let me use actually black. Midline, max, midline, min, back to midline. Okay, it is a sine function because it starts at its midline. Okay, the period, one cycle of the graph, lasts 2 pi. Okay, so its b value is going to be 2 pi over 2 pi, because you always put 2 pi over the period, which is 1. Okay, there's no x-axis reflection because it goes midline to the maximum, back to the midline, down to the minimum, back to the midline. So our equation is y equals 4, our amplitude, sine, our b value is 1, so I'm just going to put an x, and then minus 2 at the end for our midline. Okay, next graph reaches as high as 2, as low as 0. So our midline has to be here at y equals 1. Our amplitude has to be 1 because from the midline to the max and to the min is a length of 1. Okay. Watch the points, midline, max, midline, min, back to midline. So there's no x-axis reflection because it starts at its midline. It's going to be a sine function. One cycle of the graph lasts to 4 pi, so its period is 4 pi. So therefore its b value is 2 pi over 4 pi, because you do 2 pi over the period. Pi's cancel, you're left with 2/4, which is 1/2. So our equation is y equals, the amplitude's 1. We've established it's a sine function. Our b value is 1/2. We're going to put an x. Our midline is plus 1. Okay, next example. It reaches as high as 2 and as low as negative 6. So remember to find that amplitude. 2 minus negative 6 is 8 divided by 2 equals 4. So our amplitude is 4. So to find your midline equation, you either go 4 down from the maximum or 4 up from the minimum. I'm just going to go 4 up from the minimum, which leaves us here at negative 2. Remember with that other example, it's 4 up from the midline, you reach your maximum. 4 down from the midline, you reach your minimum. Okay, so our equation of our midline is y equals negative 2. Okay, This one does not start at the midline. You can see it starts up here at its maximum, maximum, midline, minimum, midline, back to the maximum. That's a cosine function. Cosine functions do not start at their midline. And look at the graph. It is not starting at its midline. It's starting at its maximum. Okay? So we're going to, nope, we don't have everything yet. We need to, the period to give us our b value. The period of this graph, one cycle, lasts a length of pi over 2. So to find our b value, we do 2 pi over 2, right? 2 pi over the period to get our b value. So 2 pi over 1 times the reciprocal. Pi's cancel. Our b value is 4. Our equation of the graph is y equals, our amplitude's 4. It's a cosine function. The b value is 4. And the midline equation is -2. Y equals -2. Okay, next example. I see it reaches as high as 7 and as low as 3. 7 minus 3 is 4. 4 divided by 2 is 2. So our midline is going to be 2 up from the minimum or 2 down from the maximum, which would make us here. Let me use a different color actually than black. Okay. There's our midline equation, y equals 5. I can see that it starts at its midline. Midline, maximum, midline, minimum, back to the midline. Okay? Ooh, this one's a funky one with the let me see here. So that's pi over 2. Ooh, it's a little off. Or the x scale is a little off on this one. Let's actually skip this one. You're not going to see, there's actually a little bit of a, looks like the scaling's off a little bit on this picture, so I'm just going to skip this one. Okay. I'm going to run over actually to delta. Today for your assignment, you're going to be responsible for these 3 sections from delta: writing trig functions given features, trig equation from a graph, and then trig graphs match multiple choice. We pretty much did the first bullet and the second bullet, and then the third one is just like the second one. But I just want to do one from each just to make sure you guys are good. So write trig function given features. Okay, so this is exactly like we were doing. The amplitude's 3, the midline is 4, the period is 5 pi over 2. It's a cosine function. So it already has f of x equals, so it has y equals for us. Our amplitude is 3. We're going to write cosine. We need to do 2 pi over the period to get our b value. So let me just go back here. I'm just going to use this page here. 2 pi over 5 pi over 2, which is going to give us, I got to go back this way, 2 pi over 1 times 2 over 5 pi. The pi's cancel. Our b value is 4/5. Okay, so we go back. I'm going to put in parentheses 4/5 x, and then our midline is +4. Check it. Perfect. Okay, let's go back out. Trig equation from a graph. Okay, write the equation. So the first thing you want to identify is your midline. So it goes as high as 3, it goes as low as -1. 3 minus -1 is 4. 4 divided by 2 is 2. So our midline has to be 2 away from the max or the min. So if we drop down 2 from here, it's going to be at y equals 1. So I'm going to start y equals, and I know at the end I'm going to have a plus 1. This, because the midline is y equals 1, this does not start at its midline. It's a cosine function. We established that from the midline, it reaches 2 above to its max, 2 below to its min, so its amplitude is 2. We're using cosine. One cycle, if you can see here, see my cursor, it goes max, midline, min, midline, back to maximum. So one cycle lasts 2 pi. So its period is 2 pi. So remember, for its b value, we do 2 pi over its period, which we said was 2 pi. So its b value is 1. So we go back. We're just going to put in 1x or just x. And then its midline was plus 1. Check it. Good. Okay. This will help you too if you need additional assistance. Remember, Delta can show you an example. Okay, and then we have one more, trig graphs match multiple choice. Which equation represents the graph shown? Okay, what do we notice? It reaches as high as 50 and it reaches as low as -10. 50 minus -10 is 60, divided by 2 is 30. So from the midline to its max and min, the amplitude is 30. Okay. We can see that its midline, 30 down from 50, is at 20. So it's a positive 20. It goes midline, maximum, midline, minimum, and back to the midline. Well, that means it has to be a sine function, okay, with a positive leading 30 because it starts at its midline and goes to its max. So the only potential that it could be is this one. Okay? Okay. So that is it for today. Make sure that um, you know, wrote down some good example problems. Understand that first find your midline, determine if the graph starts at its midline or not. If it does, it's a sine function. If it doesn't, it's a cosine function. Use the midline to the max or the min to find the amplitude. Remember to find your b value. It's 2 pi over the period, and the period is one cycle of the graph. Okay? So for today, make sure that you complete the following sections of the Delta Math assignment.